There's a particular kind of quiet that every beekeeper learns to dread. Not the silence of a dead hive that carries a different weight and you recognize it differently. This is the quiet of a hive that should be loud. A colony that's been building since February. 10, 12 frames of bees, supers going on faster than you planned, mornings so thick with forager traffic that you had to stand to one side just to avoid the drift. And then one Saturday, the air above the boxes is empty. The entrance that ran a steady roar is down to a murmur. Half the bees are somewhere you can't follow, and the ones that remain seem somehow changed. Quieter in a way that isn't peaceful. You haven't even lifted the lid yet, and you already know what happened. The swarm didn't happen that morning. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that most beekeeping literature never quite says plainly enough. What you found that morning was the conclusion of a process that had been underway for 3 weeks. In the brood nest, in the chemistry of the colony, in a structural shift that was readable if you knew where to look. The bees didn't decide to leave that morning. They decided in early April, or late April, or whenever the sequence began in your particular hive, in your particular season. And somewhere between that decision and the morning you found empty air above your boxes, there was a window, not a wide one. 5 days, maybe 7, but it was there, and there was a specific time of morning when the signal was clearest, and a specific location, not on the frames, not inside the hive at all, where it showed up first. If you've lost a swarm you didn't see coming, I'd genuinely like to hear about it in the comments. What the inspection showed afterward. What you found or didn't find on those frames. And if this kind of biological breakdown is useful to you, a like helps put it in front of other beekeepers who think this way. To understand that signal and where it appears, you have to understand something about how swarm preparation actually begins. Not how it ends. Most beekeepers know the ending. Capped queen cells along the bottom bar, bees clustering on the outside of the box. The old queen gone by noon with half the experienced foragers in the apiary. But the beginning is a different chapter entirely, and it starts not with queen biology, but with architecture, with the physical geometry of the brood nest and the way that geometry changes over the course of a productive spring build-up, changing in a direction that most beekeepers never stop to observe until the consequences are visible. A colony building hard through April and into May is doing several things at once, and they are in tension with each other. The queen is expanding her laying pattern outward, frame by frame, as population grows. Nurse bee numbers are increasing exponentially with each round of emerging brood, and foragers are returning with increasing volumes of nectar and pollen as spring forage peaks. All of that incoming material needs somewhere to go. The first available cells are the ones surrounding the active brood nest, the cells just outside the laying zone, just above the primary brood area, that the queen hasn't reached yet, or that were recently vacated as older brood emerged. Nectar gets packed there. Pollen follows. The brood nest, which was expanding freely in March when there was open drawn comb in every direction, begins to find its perimeter fixed. Not by the queen's biology, by what the foragers are bringing home. By the time a colony is covering 8 or 9 frames of bees, this has typically happened. The queen's available laying space, not her health, not her vigour, not anything wrong with her at all, has been compressed. She is still moving through the brood nest, still laying in every open cell she can find. But the open cells are fewer, and they are harder to reach, and her daily egg volume drops as a consequence. Not visibly to most inspections, not dramatically, but measurably. And this is where the biology turns in a direction that eventually shows up at the entrance. Most beekeepers open the hive first. The ones who've been at this long enough open their eyes first. At the entrance, before the hive tool ever comes out. When the brood nest compresses and the queen's daily output decreases, something specific happens to the ratio of nurse bees to available brood. More bees are emerging from the existing capped cells than new eggs are being laid to replace them. The nurse population, bees in the first 3 weeks of adult life, biologically primed to feed larvae, to tend brood, to pass chemical signals along the trophallaxis chain, begins to exceed what the brood nest can absorb. There is more nurse bee physiology than there is work for it to perform. These excess nurse bees cluster upward. They fill the space between frames in the upper box. They press against the inner cover in a dense, idle mass, and their presence there begins to do something to the colony's chemistry that doesn't show on any frame you can lift out and hold to the light. Queen mandibular pheromone is the chemical signal that holds a colony together as a coherent, non-swarming unit. It moves through the colony through direct contact and through trophallaxis, the continuous, mouth-to-mouth exchange of food and information that runs through a healthy hive like a distributed nervous system. In a colony with a normal ratio of nurse bees to brood, this transmission is efficient. QMP reaches every part of the colony. It suppresses queen cup construction. It suppresses the physiological differentiation that separates swarm bees from stay bees, and it suppresses the behavioral reorganization that, once it reaches a certain threshold, becomes very difficult to reverse. That transmission chain depends on contact frequency, and contact frequency depends on how many bees are sharing a given unit of space. When nurse bee density exceeds the brood nest's capacity to distribute them evenly, when there are more bees per cell of brood than the normal distribution accommodates, the effective concentration of queen mandibular pheromone per individual bee falls. Not because the queen is producing less, because there are more bees in the circuit than the circuit was designed to carry. The signal becomes diluted through excess population, and a growing portion of the colony begins to read that dilution as a queen-right failure signal. Not a real failure, a chemical shadow of one, an absence of information that the colony's biology interprets correctly at a population level as a reason to reproduce, a reason to swarm. Queen cells are the announcement. The decision came earlier. For Posa herb tuenses tuensmin came earlier. This mechanism, brood nest compression generating nurse bee saturation diluting QMP, QMP dilution triggering swarm preparation, is the chain that was observed and documented not in laboratory conditions but in seasonal practice across generations of careful beekeepers. Moses Quinby, writing in the 1860s, described a distinct behavioural change at the hive entrance in the weeks preceding swarming. He characterized it as a kind of sustained restlessness in the forager population, bees accumulating at the entrance in morning hours when they should be departing for the field, present in numbers that were inconsistent with the weather and the forage conditions. He didn't have the vocabulary of pheromone chemistry, of trophallaxis, of nurse bee saturation, but he had watched enough colonies through enough seasons to identify the pattern precisely, and he knew what it meant, AI root, in the early editions of the ABC and XYZ of bee culture, made a similar observation. Experienced apiarians, he noted, developed the habit of reading the entrance before they reached for the hive tool. The entrance was the first chapter of the colony's story. The frames were the second. You didn't skip chapters. That entrance-first observational habit was standard practice in American commercial beekeeping through the latter part of the 19th century and into the early 20th. It was a working diagnostic tool, used by beekeepers managing dozens or hundreds of colonies for whom catching the swarm impulse early was an economic necessity, and then it faded. Not suddenly, not through any deliberate abandonment. The frame inspection became the dominant diagnostic practice as standardized equipment spread and as beekeeping culture organized itself around the opened hive as the primary information source. The entrance became something you walked past on your way to the lid. And with that shift, a cultural shift, not a biological one, the earliest readable signal in the swarm sequence was systematically removed from the working beekeeper's toolkit. The foragers accumulating at the entrance aren't confused. They are responding to something that already broke down deep in the brood nest, a failure in chemistry that started weeks earlier, in the architecture of the hive, long before a single queen cup held an egg. Here is what that entrance signal looks like in practice, and how you distinguish it from other causes of entrance congestion. On a good foraging morning, clear sky, temperatures suitable for flight, confirmed nectar flow active in the surrounding area. Departure traffic from a healthy colony is continuous and high volume. Bees orienting outward in purposeful arcs, lifting off in dense streams, the entrance constantly cycling. What you see instead, in a colony with swarm preparation underway, is foragers stationed at the entrance who are not departing, older bees, the kind you can identify by the darkening of their abdominal segments and the wear along the leading edges of their wings. They are facing outward. They are not bearding. Bearding is loose, gravity responsive. Bees seeking airflow and heat, shifting and clustering and moving. This is different. These bees are positioned, attending the entrance as if waiting for something. A recruitment signal from inside the colony that is no longer reaching them with sufficient coherence to generate departure behavior. They wait for the signal. It doesn't come, and they are there again the next morning. And the morning after that, when this pattern holds across 2 or 3 consecutive mornings in suitable flying weather, with active forage in the area and no indication of dearth, the interpretation is clear to any beekeeper who has learned to read it. Swarm preparation is underway. The brood nest chemistry has already crossed a threshold, and there is still a window, 3 to 7 days in most cases before queen cups receive eggs, 10 to 21 days before the swarm leaves, in which a correctly targeted intervention can interrupt the sequence before the commitment becomes irreversible. If this kind of biological precision is the sort of thing you find yourself coming back to, a subscribe means more of it reaches you when it comes. Here is where the most correctable mistake in swarm management typically occurs. A beekeeper who recognizes entrance idling opens the hive and searches immediately for queen cups or queen cells, finds none, closes the hive and considers the situation resolved. This is understandable. It is also a misreading of the biological sequence. The absence of queen cups at the stage of entrance idling doesn't mean swarm preparation hasn't begun. It means the colony hasn't yet reached the phase where queen rearing is initiated. Congestion is driving the process. Queen cups are downstream. What the inspection should focus on is the architecture of the brood nest, specifically the ratio of available laying space to the current bee population, and the degree to which honey and pollen storage has migrated inward from the perimeter of the brood nest. The queen wasn't slowing down because she was failing. She was slowing down because the hive had changed around her. That is a different problem entirely, and it has a different solution. In the spring of 1942, commercial beekeepers across much of the eastern United States lost colonies to late April and early May swarms at rates approaching 40%. In the hill country of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, a network of small-scale Appalachian beekeepers recorded losses under 8%. The difference was a brood nest adjustment applied 3 to 4 weeks before the primary nectar flow, inside the architectural window, before the swarm commitment threshold was crossed. The method was not complicated. It was precisely timed. 2 frames from the inner edge of the brood nest, capped or emerging brood, not open larvae, were relocated to the outer positions of the box, not removed from the colony, just moved out of the queen's primary laying zone. In their place, directly adjacent to the frames where the queen was most actively laying, 2 frames of drawn empty comb were inserted. Drawn comb specifically. The queen needed open cells she could move into that morning. Foundation requiring new wax construction would not serve the purpose. By the time workers drew it out, the biological window would have narrowed or closed. Previously used comb, slightly darkened from prior brood cycles, was preferred because queens accept it for immediate laying more readily than bright new wax. The effect was architectural. Nurse bee density per unit of brood decreased as the queen's laying zone expanded. QMP distribution renormalized through a less congested colony. The swarm impulse that had been building toward the commitment threshold subsided. Not entirely, not in every colony, not with the certainty that comes from treating a disease, but measurably, reliably, across the documented season records of those Appalachian operations. A colony that swarms in late April loses roughly 60% of its experienced foragers at the exact biological moment when forager strength determines everything about the season's surplus. The colony that doesn't swarm enters the nectar flow intact. Full forager workforce, no queen transition underway. The entire behavioral economy of the hive organized around nectar storage rather than reproduction. The difference in honey production between those two outcomes is not close. You fix this with timing, not with equipment. The practical sequence is straightforward. During swarm season, from the first warm weeks of April through the primary nectar flow, stand at the entrance for 5 minutes before any inspection, not as a routine gesture, as a diagnostic act. Watch departure behavior in the 2 hours after sunrise. If forager traffic is purposeful and high volume, if the entrance is cycling actively outward with no unusual accumulation, open the hive and assess the frames as you normally would. If what you see is something quieter, foragers stationed at the entrance in morning light, aged and oriented outward, present across 2 or more consecutive mornings despite suitable flying conditions, that is the signal. The entrance is telling you something the frames haven't shown yet. Open the hive, but don't search for queen cups. Look at the brood nest geometry. Find the honey and pollen frames that have migrated inward from the perimeter. Identify the frames that were once active brood and are now showing mixed capped storage and thinning brood. Move those outward. Bring drawn empty comb in beside the queen's most active laying area. Verify that the resulting brood nest has a contiguous corridor of available cells she can expand into without navigating through honey or pollen barriers. Then close the hive and leave it alone. Done within the entrance idling window, before queen cups receive eggs, this intervention interrupts the swarm sequence at its architectural source. Done after queen cups hold eggs, it is still worth attempting, but the difficulty of reversal increases with each day and the certainty of outcome decreases. The window that is still open when forager idling appears is narrower than most beekeepers believe. It closes before the frames show you it's closing. Every beekeeper who has kept hives long enough has had that morning. The particular quiet that arrives where noise should be. The column of bees disappearing above the tree line, the hive standing there exactly as you left it, except reduced by half, and the season already tilting in the wrong direction. It doesn't feel exactly like failure. It feels more like arriving somewhere a moment too late, and not quite knowing when the moment passed. The moment passed 3 weeks earlier, at the entrance, on a morning that looked ordinary from the outside. The colony had already crossed a threshold you didn't know to look for, at a time of morning when the answer was sitting there in plain sight. Quinby knew to look. The Appalachian beekeepers knew to look. The habit was lost, not the signal. The signal hasn't changed. If this changes how you read your entrances going into swarm season, leave a comment. What you've seen at your own hives, what you've missed, what you're going to look for now. And subscribe if you want more of this. The historical method, the biological reasoning, the forgotten precision that works before the problem becomes visible.